Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video what I want to do is I want to walk you through the use of my Express template, which I have here. Now, straight up, this is not an introduction to Express, so I am assuming some familiarity, not a whole lot, but some familiarity with Express and Node to be able to use this template. The beauty of this is you can just quickly spin up a new Express project pretty quickly and get to work on just the actual application. That's the beauty of the template. It has a nice basic structure, so that way everything's kind of organized for you already. But you have to kind of be familiar with the organization, and that's what this video is for, just to kind of explain how I organize this template and show you how you can use it. There's two ways to create a new project from this template. So you could use GitHub, and again, the link to this template will be in the video description, and you can click Use This Template. If you wanted to create your own template, just so you know, you can create a repo, and in the settings, there's a little button here called Template Repository. So you can literally just build a boilerplate of like things you set up all the time, have it ready to go, so that in the future, all you have to do is literally whenever you create a template, you can click Use This Template, and what it does is it's actually going to go create a whole new repository in your account that's a copy of that template, and then you can clone that, and then there's your, that's a whole separate project now. So that's pretty cool. The other way you can do this, generally the way I use a lot of these templates, because then I want to skip the whole step of having to go clone the repository. What I'll do is I'll open up VS Code. So I'm gonna give VS Code a second to open up. Okay. What folder am I in here? Let's open a fresh folder. Open folder. Okay, and we'll call this Express Template 2, because this is my second attempt at recording this video. My computer froze the first time. How fun is that? But once you open up a fresh window of VS Code, and you want to make sure that the folder is empty, so you don't get an error. But I'm not going to delete this little and again, I get this VS Code folder because I have Peacock, this extension that gives the color to my VS Code, and that creates this VS Code folder that has like the settings that have the details of the colors. Like that's why that shows up, because I have that extension. So generally, you probably won't actually have anything in your blank folder. So let me just close that. Now I'm going to create a new terminal, and what you do is you use this thing called dgit. Dgit is a awesome utility for like cloning any GitHub repo without actually cloning the repo. What you do is you copy the contents of the repo, but you're not actually connected to the repo. So that way you don't have to worry about like changing remotes, and you just have the code, and then you can create a whole new Git repository if you want. So it's just always start with the words npx dgit. Npx is a command to allow you to use like a node library one time. Good for like utility libraries like dgit or create react app or nodemon, where you may want to just kind of run it off one time. Npx dgit, and what you do is you copy the name of the repo. So that's everything after the github.com. So I'm copying that, and then I paste it in here. Now, I'm not going to just put that, because right now I have this folder here, and it's going to cause an error since that's there. It wants an empty folder. It wants you to run this in an empty folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do force. So by doing -- force, what happens is that it will ignore that there's already files in there and just write the stuff in here. Okay. So now it's just going to add all the files, and see, there we go. There's all the files for that project. So I've just made a copy. Okay. So now what I can do is, again, whenever you clone a repo, because I have in my git ignore, which I should have in my git ignore, I forget that I have a global git ignore, /node node modules. So let me just put that in there, so that way it's there. I'll add it to the actual template soon enough. But /node modules, so that means you notice there's no node modules folder. So where's all my dependencies? Well, that's the beauty of the package.json. All the dependencies I used are listed in here. Okay, that's why we always make sure we have a package.json. And so now what you can do to install all the dependencies that I was using, you just type in npm install. Node's going to look in the package.json and install everything that's listed in there. Okay, and there you go. Everything's been installed. How easy was that? Okay. So that's all it takes to install. So now technically I should be able to run the server. So I can type in npm run dev because I have two scripts in here. And again, anytime you have scripts in package.json, when I type in npm run this, it'll run this command. It doesn't even have to be a node command. You could literally just run any terminal command that you want, which is pretty convenient, especially for really long commands. Okay, npm run dev. Let's see, that's going to run Nodamon. There we go. And it's running on port 333, which is going to be, is the default I set up, and you'll see that in a second. So if I go to localhost 3333, okay, I see that the main website's there. And we'll come back to like where that content's being generated from. Okay, but we also have our .env file. Now again, the .env file is also in the gitignore, because the .env file is generally where you put sensitive information like API keys, database credentials. Also, typically you'll put like a maybe a port number there, which is what I got right now. So what I do is I name the file template.env, and what you're going to do is you're going to rename it .env. So just take off the word template, and now you have your .env file. Okay, so this is where you can define any sensitive variable. So if you had like a secret, like an API key, secret for, like a JWT secret or something that you just don't want shown in your GitHub repo, you don't want people having access to, that's where you put it. Okay, because that won't get pushed to GitHub. GitHub is going to ignore that .env. Cool. Okay, so let's take a look at the server.js so we can see how like this is all put together. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that I'm not using CommonJS. CommonJS is like your default way that Node works. So by default, the way Node works is that you would use like the require to import libraries. So I would be like const express equals require express. Okay, so that's called CommonJS. What I'm using is what's called ES modules. So basically the thing that changes is how you import libraries. So notice how instead of using require, I write import express from express. That is enabled by going into my package.json. So when I created this template in my package.json, I added this, the key of type with the value of module, which enables this feature. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that because I've enabled this feature, you won't be able to use the require statement. There are workarounds, but if you want to refactor the whole thing, which then you might as well just start from scratch, you could take that out, but embrace the setup. Okay, so just so you understand how like that came to be. Okay, so you notice how I import everything using ES module syntax. Okay. Okay, so again, we have .env because that's the library that allows us to use the .env file. Okay, and then I use the function that actually loads up all those variables from the .env file. So that's what this section's doing. Here I'm importing my dependencies. So we have express because that's the framework. We have method override because that's going to allow us to use like delete and put requests with our forms if we decide to do so. Cores, that's going to be for API routes. So if you want to create like a JSON API and you want to allow other websites, like you want to create like a React page and you want it to be able to request, hit those JSON routes and not hit cores errors, that's going to fix that. Morgan's for logging. Logging is always useful to make sure that we don't catch, we see, there's no errors. Okay. Just to kind of show you, like if I refresh this page, oh, the server not running? Oh, it's 3000 now because I just changed the .env, that's right. Because the .env defines port as 3000. So there we go. Now if I go back to the terminal here, notice you see these little prints here? That's what Morgan's doing. Okay, Morgan is just saying, hey, let me just put out some information in the terminal every time the server gets requests, so that way I have something to visually look at to kind of see like, what are people asking my server for? So I see that, hey, when they requested // that was the first thing. They got back the HTML file, which we'll get into in a second. That HTML file has a JavaScript file connected to it. So then it asked my server for the JavaScript file, then it asked for the CSS file. This happened twice for some reason. And then it asked for the favicon, which is, it's always going to do by default. So you'll see that a lot. Okay, so I can see all the requests coming into my server here, and I can see how they're handled, how long they took. This allows me to kind of determine like, hey, are there any routes that are just taking too long that I may want to optimize? Are any of the routes getting not a 200 or 300 code? Because if I'm seeing a 400 or 500, that means something went wrong. Okay, so I can kind of see that. So like I see the favicons 404, which means like there is no route for that. I don't have a favicon set up. So it gets a 404. I see a 404 for the CSS. That's concerning, but we'll come back to that in a second. Okay, but that's the beauty of Morgan. I can see those logs and I can determine, hey, are things working or not? Okay, cool. Now, what I did here is that for handling routes, I tried to organize the routes into two categories. There's your main routes. Those are going to be the routes that you use to render any pages with like a templating library like EJS. Then there's your API routes, which are used to render JSON data. So for example, if I go to like /API, see I get JSON data because that's one of my API routes. Okay, so these are the two example routes, which you can see right here. There's these two routes that are created. Notice I'm not doing like app.get. So typically when you first learn Express, you use the app object and you're doing like app.get, app.post. A cool thing you can do with Express is you can create routers. Okay, so right here, I created two routers. What routers do is they allow you to create a group of routes. So instead of just having every route just registered with the app object, I can create groups. So there's two groups of routes, the main routes group and the API routes group. So whenever I want to add a route to the main routes group, it goes here. And whenever I want to add it to the API routes group, I use do API routes.get or .post or .put. Okay, but otherwise it's the same syntax. What always happens is you pass in the URL, so what should be the endpoint, and what function should run. Okay, but notice I'm not like writing an arrow function here because I'm going to be bundling the functions somewhere else. You'll see that in a moment. Okay, but as you see here, I register the two routers as middleware. And so the main routes are any route that starts with slash, so basically all other routes. But if the route starts with /API, then the API routes bundle will handle it. So I won't have to write /API again. So whenever you write a route with slash, so even though I only wrote slash here, that route was /API because I bundled that router to only work when the URL starts with /API. Okay? Just to kind of explain like how all this is connected. Okay, but just to show you this other middleware that's set up here, we have the URL encoded middleware. So that way if you submit a form directly from an HTML file to like a post route or something like that, it can parse that data. Now, if we send the data via like Ajax and we send it as JSON data, we want to be able to parse those JSON bodies as well. So we have the express.json middleware, which is more something you're going to need if you're working with APIs. Okay, method override, again, that's going to be used to override requests. So what it does is that whenever you have a form submitting in the action URL, like the URL you submit as the action of that form, it'll look inside there for a URL query. And if the URL query has a key of method, it will then change the request of the request to whatever method is specified. So if I did like, if I had a query at the end of the URL that was like underscore method equals put, it would then change that request to a put request. The reason why would you need that? The reason is because forms in HTML can only do post or get requests. So you're kind of stuck with those two. Method override allows us to bring in the put and the delete requests. Okay. Static. This is going to allow us to use this static folder as our static folder, which means literally like anytime there's an asset in the static folder, like our CSS styles. Oh, that's the problem. That should be called styles.css. So I'll just fix that real quick. I'll fix that in the template right after this video is done. Okay. And app.js. Okay. So that should be styles.css. But see, like this, so this particular file, because again, I said I'm taking this middleware and attaching it to the URL /static. To get to that CSS file, the URL would be like /static/css/styles.css. Okay, so that would be styles.css. And that's going to be for any file that's in the static folder. I can just refer to that file name using that relative URL. That's the beauty of the static middleware. It allows us to take a folder and say, hey, that folder is going to statically serve files. Okay. Morgan, this just says, hey, print stuff to the terminal. So as you saw earlier. And again, I registered the two routers. Okay, here I'm turning on cores, but look, I'm only attaching it. Because see, not only can you have middleware that's global, so whenever I use the app object, so whenever I do app.use, app.get, that's global. Okay, so it's for every request is going to hit that. Now, API routes, if I register middleware there using API routes.use or register routes with API routes.get or .post or .put, that's only registering it if that router is used, which means it's only going to be used for URLs that start with /API. So what Cores is doing here is just going to make it where other websites can make a request to those particular routes. So those routes will be blocked from external requests. If you ever use like an API and got into Cores error, well, that's what happens when that isn't allowed. Like if Cores isn't enabled, you get those Cores errors when you try to do like an AJAX request. Okay, so that's how we prevent that from happening but it's always at the backend side. Whoever writes the backend server, which I'm doing right now, determines who has access to what. Okay, and then there's our server listener. Okay, that just basically turns on the server. So that's literally it. Okay, so basically what you would do is you would just write routes. You can just, if you want to add more main routes, you just use this, and if you want to add routes to the API routes collection, you add it there. Okay, now notice I don't write the whole functions here, so that way this file doesn't get too crowded. What I did is I created two classes. So for example, if I wanted to create a new route, so let's say, hey, I want to create main routes dot get / example. Okay, I wanted to create that route. What I would do is I'm going to add another function to this main controller. So I'm just going to assume that that function is going to be called main example dot main controller dot example2. Okay, called example2. So there, that's all set up. Now you notice how it's giving me an error because there's no such thing as main controller.example2. So what I need to do is head over to the main controller file, and there's this class. Okay, and all I have to do is just add the function to the class. So I'll say example2, and again, as all express route functions they need to take two arguments, rec and res. And then here I can determine what the function does. So I can just say, and I'll just say like res.send, and I'll just send a string with an h1. h1 hello world. Okay, and let's see here. It looks like it's still crashing, so let's see why. Route.get requires a callback function, but I got an object. Got an object undefined. That should be fixed now. So let me just see if there's a typo here. Main controller dot. Oh, I spelled example2 wrong. Example2. Yep, and there we go. It's working. So long as this function is defined in that class, this is going to work. So this just makes it where I don't have to put everything all piled up in one file. So this file doesn't get too cluttered, and I can see the routes more in a list style. So I just know like, hey, this URL is going to attach to this function that belongs to this class. And then I can always just go to the file with that class in it. Because what I did is I imported those classes into this file. See right here, I imported the two classes. Then I instantiated the two classes. So I created an instance of main controller, an instance of API controller. And now you can just use those here. Okay. So you would just follow that same pattern if you wanted to add more controllers or more routers. You know, everything kind of here is try to be like clearly labeled. Okay, but so now I should be able to go to /example, and I can see that h1. Okay, because when I go to that route, when I hit this route, it's going to hit this function, and then this function is defined right here. Okay, so simple as that. Now, what if I want to add another API route? Okay, well, it's the same idea. So I'd go over here and I'd say, hey, I want to make another API route. So I'd be like API routes.get, and I would say, let's say /example again. And then I say like API controller dot example2. And I'd go to, now instead of going to the main controller file, I'm going to go to the API controller file. And I would add the method there. Example2 rec res. Okay, and then I'm going to send some JSON data. So we'll say JSON, and I'm going to send over an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's what I'm going to send over. Now keep in mind that here on the server, even though I wrote example here, this router is hidden behind the API URL. So technically the URL is going to be has to start with /API. So it's going to be /API and then /example. So now I go here and I do /API/example, and see I get the array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so it becomes pretty easy to kind of keep all your API routes separate from like your pages. And just to show you like that main page. So again, that main page is running this example function from the main controller. So I go back to the main controller, and that's rendering this example.ejs file here. And this example.ejs file, if we go to our views folder, because again, the way templating works in Express is that whenever you use this render function, it's always going to look in the views folder for the file you specified here. And EJS is pretty easy to use. You don't have to do any configuration because the library has the same name as the file extension. Because that's the default. Like what Express will do is that it assumes that there's an engine, a library you installed that has the same name as the file extension. So for like handlebars, it'd be handlebars, like a .handlebars file or a .mustache file for mustache. But we're using EJS, so it's pretty straightforward. And then again, I'm sending this data to the template. So that's rendering this example.ejs file here. And notice I have all these includes. So this way you can have a consistent look through all your pages. Like they all have the same navigation, same footer, same head. Basically you have all these includes. These are like little template pieces. So instead of me having to rewrite the whole HTML file every time, I can have a singular one that I can use over and over again. And that's going to be in this partials folder. So you have one for the head. So here's where you put like all your link tags and script tags. So you see here, the app.js is already like linked there. The styles.css is already linked there. Okay, and here I have jQuery already kind of set up for you. And this tag here is being injected in that example EJS by this line right here. Okay, that's a really cool feature in EJS where you can actually like, instead of having to put everything in one EJS file, you can have multiple EJS files that you can reuse. And that's really nice. So again, you can find the header EJS to do your header, and my recommendation would be just to copy this whenever you do another EJS file, so that way you can have a consistent, template design of your website without having to like redesign, restyle everything. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Let me just go back and just make sure that the CSS file is working. So let me go back to the main page. Okay, and I'm still getting a 4 for the CSS file. That is strange. Now, why is that? Because it should be /static. Let's try it out. /static /styles.css. It says cannot get it. Okay, so it's not finding the file. So there's something wrong with the static middleware. Well, first, we'll diagnose it together so you learn how to find these things, and then I'll fix it in the template right after this is over. So when I do app.use express.static, let me just make sure I'm using the right function. Static, serve static, root string. It serves static files and it's based on serve static. Yeah. Okay, so I'm saying serve static based on the word static. Am I spelling that right? Static. Oh, I didn't write slash. I forgot the folder name. So let me try this again. CSS. Because I had a folder called CSS. Okay, so that works. So I probably forgot that. Did I forget the folder name? So let me go back to my head.ejs. And yes, I did. I forgot that the file's in a folder called /css, and this is in a folder called js. Because if we go back here to my static folder, see I put them in a CSS folder and the JS folder. So I got to make sure I include that in the relative URL. Because again, this starting from static, everything else is like based on the way it's organized in that static folder. So now let me refresh. See if we go back to the main page. Do I get, yep, and that looks right. Okay, good. Okay, and then I look here and I see that the static style CSS. Well, let me refresh the page one more time. Still getting 404, even though it is getting connected, so that's strange logs. Let me just do this. Let me actually just restart the server, just make sure that that is exactly the way I think it is. I hit refresh. Okay, and that time it looked good. Okay, so I didn't get any errors because everything's looking good. and it's a 304, which means it used the cache. So that means it didn't. Let me do a. I'm going to hold shift and do a refresh, so that way we get see if it gets to 200. Oh, back to terminal, and yeah, that looked good. See 200, that's good. Favicon, there is no favicon, so that's fine. If I did want a favicon, I would just put it in the static folder. I would just put it right there in the static folder, favicon.ico. I would go like in Google and say, hey, can I find a favicon generator, and just stick it in there, and it will work, because that's where it's going to look. So yeah, that's how this template works. Hopefully you guys found this useful and found it as some fun review of just sort of like how Express can work. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.